Welcome to the Health Science Podcast, sponsored by the National Health Association. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino, and I'm very pleased today to have as my guest Julieanna Hever, who is a registered dietitian. In fact, she is the plant-based dietitian. She is known that way, and she is the author of the Idiot's Guide to Plant-Based Nutrition, co-author of the book, The Idiot's Guide to Gluten-Free Vegan Cooking, and she spent a lot of years merging and marrying her interest in plant-based nutrition with fitness to help really people transform their lives and health. Welcome, Julieanna. I'm so excited that you're here. Thank you for being here. Welcome to the Health Science Podcast, brought to you by the National Health Association, the oldest organization in the world championing the extraordinary benefits of a whole plant food diet and healthy lifestyle, as well as water-only fasting. We believe that health results from healthful living and focus on evidence-based science that promotes the health of you and your loved ones, as well as the health of all animals and the environment. We feature experts from a cross-section of disciplines within the plant nutrition, vegan, psychological, environmental, and animal compassion sectors. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino, the NHA's Director of Health Education.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, as I was going over a little bit of your background and history, you made the point that you had been influenced on this path as early as your teenage years for your love of animals and so on, and were even influenced by the work of John Robbins, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But it took many years until you really went into your professional training before you were confident and convinced that this would be a way to really follow a nutritional path. So can you talk a little bit about your personal journey? Let people know a little bit about how you got to where you are. I think they'll be excited to hear that.
Sure. Thank you. Yes, I was always very interested in nutrition and fitness and health. And I started reading everything I could growing up, just every book I can get my hand on. And one day I stumbled upon John Robbins' Diet for a New America. And that was the first book published on the connection between diet and health and animals and the environment. And he's since told me that the publishers were like, you can't talk about all of that, but he did. And it really hit me because it was the first time I'd heard about any of that. It was pretty shocking. So I didn't want anything to do with that industry. So I just decided cold tofu, I'm done with animal products. I'm just not going to eat them. But I didn't know what that meant. And I was a teenager and I didn't cook. And so my parents, I tried to do this for a little while and they were like, you're going to be a veg what? What are you talking about? We didn't know anybody that was eating this way. And so eventually they held what I like to refer to as my intervention. And they enlisted our family friend, a nurse, Kendra, and we all went out to a steakhouse and they ordered me a teriyaki steak with a pineapple ring on top as Kendra proceeded to tell me how I'm going to be deficient in B12 and iron and protein and all of the things. And of course, as a young girl, I was nervous as she got me, properly afraid because I didn't know the answers to any of those conundrums, if you will. But I just remember looking at that steak and it was really hard because once you know, you can't unknow. And it was really hard to have that first bite. But I was scared enough to go, okay, well, I've eaten them my whole life. Maybe I need to do this. And I did. But I couldn't help but think that the vegetarians weren't making headlines of dying off, like this whole weird species. So I knew there had to be more to the story. But I continued on my journey to learn. And so I kept reading and reading. And long time later, I ended up becoming a dietitian and, getting my master's in nutrition and learning about statistics and physiology and all the things that gave you all the answers. And I picked up a bunch of clues during graduate school that kind of gave me the answers. It kind of brought everything to a forefront. It was like, I remember studying about how dairy was so important. And if you don't have this much, your teeth are going to fall out. And then you'd see at the bottom of that little pamphlet it was sponsored by the Dairy Council. And I remember going to the first and only conference I ever went to. It was the American Dietetic Association at the time. And I remember walking into the expo and there were these huge booths by the dairy industry and the sugary cereal industry and McDonald's. And I was like, wow, it was like the influence of the industry was mind blowing because it was in your face. And these were healthcare professionals that they were addressing. So I kept gathering data and still very curious. So when I finally graduated and I had my daughter, my first kid, and I started digging back into the research and I'm like, you know what, it's time, I'm ready. And so, because I could find out where you can get your B12 and your iron and your protein from, and it's actually better sourced from plants. And I did, I transformed my diet first and I had extraordinary outcomes as we see, like I cleared up lifelong sinus infections, acne I'd struggled with for decades, gone, GI, all the problems. I just felt better than ever. And then I started implementing it as I began my dietetics practice. And that was it. Then I started seeing all the amazing things that you've seen over your career. And it's just, right. I haven't stopped being able to talk about it ever since.
It takes me back to my childhood, because, this is before your time, but back when I was in grammar school, you had all of those charts on all the middle schools, the 4 basic food groups, and 2 of them, of course, were meat and dairy. And no one ever thought to turn those charts around to see that they were sponsored by the meat and dairy councils at the time, so it brings me back to that understanding. So it wasn't a big conflict for you going through. Most RD programs conventionally are teaching a lot of conventional nutrition. You were open to looking at that while you were investigating the other side of that coin, so to speak. And then you became very fervent once you gathered that data to understand that this was a better path in terms of how you were going to live and how you might be able to counsel people over time. I gather that's the path and how it went.
Well, it's a very good point. And it's actually an important point, because people reach out to me all the time and say they want to go through a dietetics program, but are concerned about that. But really, the truth is, you're not really learning about that stuff in physiology and statistics and, all the other things, medical nutrition therapy. You're not really like being indoctrinated, if you will. It does show up, but food science is food science, and, statistics are statistics. And there's a few classes where it will come out. But nowadays, I've gone back to my alma mater and spoken, and it's a thing now. Plant-based nutrition is a thing. It's an accepted entity. And so I think nowadays it would be a no-brainer. But even when I was doing it, it wasn't a big deal. It wasn't in my face so much. And I wasn't even there yet. I was still like thinking I was eating the standard. I was trying to make a healthy standard Western diet at the time without a bias, because I really hadn't changed completely yet. So I think it's a very good thing to have. And then you have all the science to answer all the questions, and then where you get all those things from. And you have this, it's a really good thing if you're interested in pursuing that path. I would encourage anyone that's interested to do so.
Yeah, we're seeing that same dance going on in medical education, where you're seeing young people going in as physicians who are open to this idea that you actually can help people heal major problems, not only prevent them, but to reverse them. But of course, the conventional teaching and the conventional wisdom in these schools is still, we're going to be disease care managers, and there's no way you can help people heal anything, and nothing can be reversed. So you're seeing the younger body of people getting exposed to that, and hopefully those trends will start to really shift and change, and we can have an expansion of consciousness that starts really shifting that along the way. It's interesting. You went kind of full circle. I noticed that you became an executive director with Earth Save International. So you ended up with kind of John Robbins in the long run anyway, which is kind of very intriguing. Tell me about that, and how you see your work. Are you still connected with that? That may be some old stuff. I don't even know. Are you still connected with Earth Save?
It was really exciting because I finally got to hear him speak. He was profoundly influenced my life. Like, it was one of those like nuggets that changed the trajectory of my life. Right. And he didn't know it at the time, but I have so much love for that man. And I saw him speak for the first time, I want to say like 15 years ago. And I remember I went up to the microphone, after he spoke, and I was crying, and I'm like, you make me want to be a better person. And I was pouring my heart out to him, and he gave me the biggest hug. And I was like, oh my God, this is such a dream come true. And then later on, I got to be executive director of Earth Save International. I was able to work on some projects with him. I've interviewed him. He's interviewed me several times throughout the years. And I feel so grateful because he's definitely played a foundational role in my whole life.
I'm here with Julieanna Hever, and we're talking about all things plant-based and her journey. We're going to take just a very short break to hear from our sponsor, the National Health Association, and we'll be right back. You're listening to the Health Science Podcast Show. I want to remind you to visit the National Health Association website, where you'll find incredible resources to support your healthy lifestyle, including plant-exclusive eating without added salt, oil, and sugar. Simply go to healthscience.org or nationalhealthassociation.org. Be sure to check out membership, which is only $35 per year for those living within the United States and $55 for those living outside the U.S. You'll be amazed at all the information and benefits you'll receive. As a member, you're kept up to date on the latest evidence-based tools for health promotion. You'll receive the incomparable quarterly magazine, Health Science, a beautiful 40-page advertising-free publication mailed to your home or offices, loaded with articles, recipes, inspirational stories, and interviews with world leaders in the fields of personal health, plant-based nutrition, water-only fasting, animal rights, and environmental support. And you'll receive details about life-changing events, such as the extraordinary annual conference of the National Health Association and diverse opportunities for plant-exclusive NHA cruises and travel vacations to exotic destinations around the globe. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino, and now back to the show. Welcome back to the Health Science Podcast. I'm here with my special guest, Julieanna Hever, who is the plant-based dietitian, author of The Idiot's Guide to Plant-Based Nutrition. Let's talk about the book itself. The compulsion to write that book, I gather there are some themes about trying to influence people with the idea that it's really not as difficult as people have tried to make it, and that there are controversies that really are not very grounded and founded. Talk a little bit about that book and what it's done in terms of your work and the people that you've influenced. I'm very curious about that.
Well, this was my very first book, and this was a long time ago. I think I wrote it in 2009, 2010.
Oh,
and
okay.
I was actually hired to write the complete Idiot's Guide to Vegan Nutrition. And I got the job, it's like the agent reached out to me. This was very much at the beginning of this quote unquote movement where it was becoming, where call it Dr. Campbell coined whole food plant-based as a term, and where that was just starting to become a thing. And that was around the time when Bill Clinton had his heart attack and he had Dean Ornish on Sanjay Gupta, and they were talking about plant-based. It became a thing, and Dr. Esselstyn was on there. So it was becoming a thing. And I remember thinking, I don't want to write this book about the ethics. That's not me. I'm a dietitian. Like, my expertise is in nutrition. And I didn't want to step on that because that's not my role. And I wanted to handle it just from nutrition. And so I did this whole petition to my publishers and asked to switch the title midway to plant-based nutrition. And my agent's like, oh no, honey, they don't change the titles, but I had a whole list of arguments on why I thought that would be helpful. And just to get that part out of it, just to focus, this is a science-based nutrition book. And it worked. They changed the title, ended up being their best-selling Idiot's Guide out of all the Idiot's Guides, and did really, really well. In fact, I've since done a second edition. And it's a very templated type of format, the Idiot's Guides. And so I had to do a very formatted, they gave me the template, but I wanted to make it simple. I wanted it to be the book that when I wanted to go plant-based after reading John Robbins' book, I wanted to know how and why and what, and then recipes. And so I had 6 weeks to write this book, and I had 2 toddlers, and I was a full-time mom. And then at the end, they're like, oh, and you have to do 50 recipes. And I'm like, recipes? I don't know how to cook. What are you talking about? I'm a dietitian. So I had to teach myself how to cook and do recipe development and do all that in 6 weeks. And somehow I threw it together, but it was a really exciting experience. It did. It was like a platform that kind of launched that part of my career.
You've done this and I've done this because I raised a family of 5 children, and you have children, and you're a working mom and a busy person with your consultations and your work. We have people out here that have, families and are making, and more people are coming into the arena of vegan and plant-based nutrition. So let's talk a little bit about what you've discovered and the things that are important in the transition for families, because we're raising children, and mine are a little older now, but we're raising children in pretty much still a junk food world with dietary stuff that they're surrounded by that's horrible and problematic. So let's talk about the steps for families and how you view that as a dietitian and some of the recommendations you make to help families make that transition. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Well, it's very interesting because not all families are the same at all. And most of the time, and this happened within my own family personally, not everyone was on the same page. And I think if everyone's on the same page, it's a lot easier. And I do have clients that come to me and they all want to make the transition, or at least the parents both want to make the transition. And so they make the transition, and that makes it so much easier because it's already difficult enough to teach your kids to eat healthy, let alone if you're trying to push a message or like be a little more unique than most of the people in your neighborhood. So the idea is you get on the same page as much as you can, or at least you make your, decisions on how you're going to go about doing it. Because the best thing, even just to create a healthy home for children, to raise them in a healthy food environment, the whole idea is everyone's eating this. This is what's for dinner. It's not, there's no questions. It's not the short order chef type of thing. That makes it very, very complicated. And that was a big source of contention in my house, that I would make all this elaborate meal and then one kid would say, I don't like this because it was vegetables or whatever. And so then their dad would go and make them something else. And then it never was cohesive. And that was so stressful. So I got it from the worst possible scenario, but then I've since guided thousands of families to do it a healthier way. And that is, you're all having those foods at home. You're encouraging the children. You're having them get involved. You start a garden. You take them shopping. You have them pick a recipe. You celebrate these delicious, whole, healthy foods. And instead of saying, yeah, you eat your broccoli, but I'm going to be over here eating my ice cream, you're role modeling, because the research shows that the most effective thing is role modeling, because they're seeing, it doesn't matter what you say, it's what you're doing that the children are emulating. So,
well, we had 5 children, right? And you brought up a great point, and you said your husband would make an alternative if they didn't want what you had put out. And we always put out great food. And with 5 kids, you can guarantee that someone's not going to like something. But homie, don't play that. And all I would say is, that's great. You don't want it. I'll see you at breakfast. And what I found, because so many children, I see so many parents get held hostage by that dance, where they'll start running around and going to the store and trying to get, and the bottom line is you're trying to entrain behaviors. And the other thing, let me get your take on this, what you think about this. Because back in those days when I was making that transition, my experience is nobody I've ever met or counseled loves deprivation. In fact, if I tell you not to do something, there's almost a little part of your brain that wants to try to do that, and probably try to do that in my face. So what do you feel about the less healthy, more processed vegan alternatives that mock and mimic some of these other foods in a transition? Meaning that, instead of turning someone off depending on where they are in their own evolution, are you open to that, or are you categorically against using more processed vegan alternatives?
I think you said it all right there in your question. It's that for the first time, the last 7, maybe 10 years now, I'm seeing vegans, long-term vegans, coming to me with the same health issues as the omnivores. And when I look at the food journal, every single time it's, cookies, candies, burgers, fries, shakes. Those are not healthy foods, no matter what you do to them. Yes, maybe they're slightly healthier if they're without animal products, but they're animal-free versions of junk food. And they have this health halo on them. This is a very big pitfall going on in the movement right now. And I think if the vegan movement wants to grow, and this is why I don't like to talk about it as vegan. Because that's an exclusive definition. It means I don't eat animals, but what are you eating? And if the vegan movement itself wants to encourage more people to go vegan, we got to have a healthy vegan population. And I'm even more concerned about the research that's going to come out later, because there's not going to be those wonderful stratifications that we see now. If you're comparing the vegans to the vegetarians, to the, pescatarians, to the omnivores, and you see this stratified beneficial effect of eliminating animal products, that's no longer going to be the case. If we looked at people now, they look the same. They're still eating lots of saturated fat, lots of sugar, the things that we know are health damaging. So I'm very concerned about it. Honestly, it's a big issue. And
I'm sorry.
And I want people to love whole foods. Your palate shifts, and we want palates to be, enjoy the amazing qualities of delicious, wholesome foods. And when you bring up your palate to those thresholds with the sugar, oil, salty, floury, processed foods, your palate shifts in that direction, and it makes it harder to eat the wholesome foods that are the ones that are going to bring you these extraordinary health outcomes that we've seen with our patients throughout the years. So it's a really interesting, tenuous balance, I think.
Well, it's kind of intriguing, because people like Milton Mills and even the nutritionists like Brenda Davis, who are all good friends, of course, they advocate whole food, plant exclusive nutrition. But it's intriguing that there are some studies on those faux foods that show people eating them will have lower cholesterol levels, lower outcomes of type 2 diabetes. So the use of some of those in a period of transition may be worth a discussion. I don't advocate those foods, because I'm someone who advocates whole plant exclusive foods that are unprocessed foods. But in looking at bringing people into the fold, because it's not just a nutritional thing. You've made this point early on, that it's our relationship to animals, our relationship to environment. And if these things can bring people into the fold, and we can educate them enough to make them realize that these are not optimal foods, but they have maybe some short-term run in a transition to this way of living, maybe there's some value in that. So I I go different ways at different times with that discussion, because I'm really at a point now when I look at the trauma that goes on in animal abuse and environmental abuse, I'm really wanting to bring people into the fold. And when I talk about vegan, to me, it's also a whole lifestyle that involves clothing and all of that. We have 140 million tons of animal parts that are used for clothing and hides for shoes and belts. And so there's a certain amount of that almost has to be part of that discussion. And not everyone's going to embrace that discussion that way. But I think we have to somehow be cognizant of it and kind of bring it up. And you brought up a good point, because when we talk about the optimal approach, we're talking about whole plant foods. And of course, people like Colin Campbell have written books like Whole, where they really discuss this idea that whole foods provide a panorama of nutrients that we can't even mimic in the production of supplementation and things of that nature, because we don't know what all of those things are. We keep discovering them. So where do you stand, and where do you fit? Where do you see with the people you counsel this whole role of supplementation? Let's address that just a little bit, coming from the RD that you are, with all the years of experience that you have.
I would love to, but I would also love to cap off what you just said, is that I agree with you. I don't disagree with you that they can play a role, those processed foods, but it does depend on where they're at. And I also really want to emphasize that there's no such thing as perfection. And I always want to recommend people not aim for perfection, because that will never get you anywhere, ever. And it's the enemy of making progress. I really, really see that. I've seen that for 18 and a half years, right, without question. So we're on
the same page with that, for sure. All the years of counseling people, I tell people, don't shoot for perfection and sainthood. It's going to take 3 miracles and a good resume, and no one's going to make it. But your point is so well made, in that the caveat is we do have to be careful with the explosion of processed vegan foods, because I think it can take a movement down the wrong path. And it's just another way for corporate entities to get the dollar and the buck, when they realize that there's a population of people that will now eat processed food that's not animal based, and we can still keep our coffers running and the profit going. And I think that's a big point, and a big point to consider. So talk to me about the whole food versus supplementation approach, and where you see that fitting into the day-to-day experience of people.
Well, I am an advocate for aiming for optimization, right? Like there is no such thing as a perfect diet. Every diet has its caveats. Every diet has its, things you have to be concerned about. The standard Western diet, there's no folate and vitamin C and fiber. And on a vegan diet, you're not getting B12 directly. You're not, everyone has to be concerned about D. There's a lot of I call them the notable nutrients. That said, I do a lot of weight loss with my clients. That's mostly what I do, is take my clients through a weight loss transformation. That's the majority of what I've been doing the last few years. That's what my last book, The Choose You Now Diet, is about. And when you're creating a deficit to lose weight, it's even more important, because every bite, all the whatever landscape the real estate you have on your plate is even more limited. So it has to count more. And so I do have my clients take just a multivitamin. I do make sure everyone on a plant-based diet, no matter what they're doing, is taking a source of B12, because B12 deficiency is the most simple, cost-effective, safest thing to avoid deficiency, and the irreversible, potentially neurological all these horrible things that could happen just from one little thing that you could do so simply. Just taking your B12 is a real big issue. And vitamin D is an issue across the board. It seems like people are still struggling with having low vitamin D levels, and that came up a lot with COVID and all of that, and immunity and bone health and all that. And of course, stuff is always fluctuating, and we're learning more, and the research unfolds. But right now, I do have my clients taking a multivitamin that has B12 and D and iodine and zinc. Right. And, and I also am still encouraging my clients to take a long chain omega-3 fatty acid microalgae formula. So they have a DHA EPA formula. Just if you're not eating fish, you're going to have a lower levels of those longer chain omega-3 fats in your blood. Do we need that? We think so. We're not sure, because then if you look at the research, vegans tend to have lower risk for potentially Alzheimer's, and definitely for cardiovascular disease and other things. But still, most of us we kind of are in cahoots about just recommending a microalgae supplement.
Yeah, there's some real controversy about those linear pathways from ALA to EPA and DHA, because now some new data has come out to suggest that while the ALA conversion is so small, which was always the argument for taking EPA and DHA, like less than 1%. There seems to be synthesis and storage in liver and fat cells that actually can release that longer over time. So I'm excited to see that story kind of unfold. Where you are right now, what you've stated is, I think, where most people would feel the most comfortable. But I think we're missing certain data that talks about storage and synthesis in ways that are a little bit different than what the party line has been. But the mentality is, I understand it, and I think it's a very wise way that you approach that. I'm here with Julieanna Hever, and I want you to please let the people know where they can go to find you, to learn more about your work, to find out more about what you're doing. What's the URL and the location they can go to?
Sure, thank you. So my website, where everything else is plantbaseddietitian.com. So that's plantbaseddietitian, spelled with a T.com.
That's beautiful. Now, I also noticed, you made the point that back in the day when you were in graduate school, you kind of paid your way by being involved in fitness. You were really doing in-home and in-club fitness coaching and all of that. So you've really, in your life and in your mind, I see that you've married that idea of the importance of fitness with plant-based nutrition and these other pillars of lifestyle change. So talk about your interest in fitness and how you integrate that with the people that you work with, or do you have separate people that you only do fitness with? How does it work for you?
Sure. So I became a personal trainer right out of undergrad when I finished college. And that's what I did. I started a personal training business. I started knocking on people's doors way back in the 90s. And I built up my practice. I loved it. I would go to people's homes and little gyms, and I would just train them. And I loved it so much. I became very close to my clients. But when I became a dietitian and I had my children, so I had to stop personal training. So I shifted over to mom/dietitian from home kind of a situation. But I've always kept up my personal training, and I love it so much. So I still consult. So when I do a consultation with any of my clients, I do have them fill out their fitness history, their current fitness protocol. And then based on what their goals are, I help them design their workouts and help modify as we go based on their goals. I also work with a bunch of athletes and elite athletes and weekend warriors and everything in between. So they're definitely interlinked. I mean, all the health, like you said, that's the different tenets. Mindfulness is a big thing that I've been really emphasizing the last few years, but Beautiful. Mindfulness and fitness and nutrition. But of course, diet is number one. It's the number one cause of early death and disability. But all those other things come into play and help navigate towards optimal health in a really beautiful, synergistic way.
Now, you get a lot of people that come to you, obviously, that are in all different phases of making a transition into plant-based eating. So talk to me about how you juggle the advice that you give and what's some of the best advice you can give people as they're making these very powerful transitions. Because some people are very far along, some people are absolute novices and want to know. So talk to me about your best advice for how you counsel people through all of those different stages and how you approach it and how you view that.
It's such a good question. It's such a good point. And it took me many years. It took me at least a decade to realize that I wasn't going to help everyone, and I can't convince people. This was the hardest lesson I've learned as a mother, as a daughter, and as a dietitian, is that you can lead a human to healthy, but you can't make them eat. And So the first few years I was trying to convince everyone. I thought I could help everyone. And here, look at this study and watch this document. Well, there wasn't documentaries back then, but read this and look at this. And my patient did this. And I was beating my head against the wall. And I realized, wait, if you really want to fight about eating chicken, then you know what? There's so many dietitians that will help support you. I'm going to tell you to eat more plants. And so I decided to say, no, I have to I kind of finagle my interviews with my potential clients to see which ones I can help, because I only want to help people I can help and not spend time with the people that aren't even interested in this messaging. So that was a huge help and a whole shift in my career. But that said, now I do have people at all different stages, but now they all want to make the change because they have to want to make the change. So I always want to make it easy. It should be as simple as possible. Again, I get rid of the idea of perfection. Go back to what you know. All of us have been eating plant-based things without thinking about it. We all grew up eating maybe oatmeal or fruit salad or pasta primavera or bean and rice burrito or veggie sushi, or there's all the things that we just didn't think of as we didn't name them as plant-based. So I say, go back to what you know that's familiar, start there. And nowadays, it's never been easier because you could literally go on the web and type in whole food plant-based, fill in whatever recipe you're in the mood for, whatever it is, you'll find it, and you'll find a whole food plant-based version of it, and many versions usually. So it's really easy, just like, what are you in the mood for? And the other thing I like to tell people to keep it super simple is most of us are really creatures of habit. Most of us eat the same. We rotate between the same 1 or 2 breakfasts, maybe 3 or 4 lunches, maybe 5 or 6 dinners in a week. We really rotate through maybe 8 or 10 recipes in a week. So all you really need, it's not overwhelming. All you really need is to find your new favorite 8 to 10 recipes that you could rotate through. And it just start one at a time. So when I was starting before the internet, I would find a recipe and I would modify it. And if I loved it, I would put a heart on it. And if my kids loved it, I would get an extra heart and I would go in a pile. If I didn't love it, I would try to modify it more. And if it didn't work, I just threw it out and went to the next one. And I eventually had a pile of recipes that I love to make. And so you just build your repertoire slowly over time. You don't go crazy and try to make the most amazing, elaborate gourmet meals. You don't have to, unless you're a chef, and then it's kind of fun. But you could just build on what you know and start with what you do know, and just keep building and exploring. And nowadays, there's never been a better time to find options and delicious options. And I always say, I just want you to eat a diet based on vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, mushrooms, nuts, seeds, herbs, and spices in infinite tasty combinations, because there's no limit to how you can make those dishes from all around the world, all the different cuisines, all the different textures and flavors. There's a whole entire, I always say the world is your oyster mushroom, and there's no limit to what you can enjoy.
You know, in this association, they've made, because of the work going way back into the 60s and 70s, when they were dealing with corporate entities that were really making these hyper palatable foods to find that bliss point combination of salt, oil, and sugar and crunchiness that would be able to sell products to the greatest number of people. This association has taken the step of going plant exclusive, but SOS free, salt, oil, and sugar free. Now that's a big step for people, especially the salt and the oil to some degree, and especially not cooking with oils and using fats only in whole food form. Where do you kind of stand in your mind on that whole idea of SOS free? Do you think it's a viable thing for many of the people you work with, or do you approach it that way? Or how does it work for you? How do you see that?
I don't like to call it that because it sounds so emergent and imminent and awful.
It does. It sounds oppressive. It does.
It does. And I don't like that term, but I like to say just eat whole food. So I really do. I focus on mindfulness. My clients come to me. A lot of people say, can you just give me a meal plan? I say, absolutely not. What's the point of that? You could follow a diet. Anyone could follow a diet. I want to change your life, teach you how to, fish, right? Make a soup instead of give you a soup. And so it's very easy to make some tweaks in the kitchen and make those foods taste delicious. Like I do a lot of videos on oil-free cooking, and you don't even really miss it for most intents and purposes. If you need a little splash of chili oil for a recipe or sesame oil for the pungent flavor, a little drop is not going to do any harm. So it's about how you use it and how you consider it. But I do a lot of weight loss, and a lot of people, even on a vegan diet, are coming to me with 30, 50, 150 pounds that they need to lose because they're eating all of those foods. And
Right.
so I love that I've watched thousands of people's palates shift, and it will shift. It's just a matter of getting used to it. And so I definitely recommend none of my recipes, except for the 1 or 2 that I co-authored, that they made me put in a little bit of oil, which drove me crazy, and flour, but I don't in most of my recipes use any of those ingredients. So I publish hundreds of recipes without any of them, with all these different cuisines. And you just make delicious food, and you just pick different foods, and then you adjust accordingly.
Well, you hit on something so powerful because, we have those addictions to salt and sugar and so on. You made a point, and I make this point too, that we tend to cook with too little herbs and spices, which have incredible nutritional value, but also gustatory value, meaning that they create such a value in taste and all of that they can compensate for those things that we're recommending people leave out. And I think when you highlight that, like you have mentioned that you do, I think that's a remarkable way to get our palate into really appreciating, again, the nuances of taste that plants can provide. Because these herbs and spices, if you think about it, they've been used for centuries in a lot of ethnic cultures that have been doing plant-based food prep for centuries. And it's one of the ways that we can get that sense of taste up, where you don't feel like you're missing out when you take away all these additives and flavorings. So I love that you're highlighting that. I think it's so important and so powerful.
I also find it really fascinating because I can empathize. Like I dieted my whole life. I started out, I didn't tell you, like the very beginning was when I was a little girl and I was a dancer. Like I danced before I walked, and I grew up in front of the ballet mirror. And one day when I was growing, in that phase of womanhood as a little girl, my dance teacher called out from across the room, "Juliana, cut out your snacks," in front of all of my ballet colleagues, which was horrifying. So I spent my life like really wanting to understand diet. And I used to be a sugar, like most people, a sugar obsessed person. You know, me and my sister would bake batches of cookies and ice every day, sugar, sugar, sugar. And then I went through all those diet phases, so Diet Cokes and all that stuff. And my threshold for sweetness was like most people on the common Western diet. And what happened to me unintentionally was I started switching over when I made this transition when I was about 30, when I had my kids. And I started like making whole food sweeteners. I would use like date paste, or I would use, and I would use fruit sweeteners. And all of a sudden, without even noticing it, I didn't want anything sweet anymore. And even on my birthday, I don't want cake anymore. I'd rather have something, even fruit sometimes is too sweet. And a sweet potato is like candy. And that happened unintentionally, which to me gives me hope, because if I could be that person, like anyone could be that person. And I've since watched so many people do that. So I just confirmation that your palate absolutely shifts. Your taste buds are changing every 3 weeks. You're getting a new set of taste buds. They're all kind of keep regenerating. So it's really kind of amazing just how powerful habit and consistency can be.
Absolutely. Let me ask you a question as a dietitian and how you stand on this, because you do a lot of work with weight regulation, and I've done that for most of my professional life for 40 plus years. What do you feel about the dance of intermittent fasting, which is really not a fast, but it's a time-restricted pattern of eating? Do you feel that that's oppressive for the people you work with? Do you feel that it has some value? Do you feel that it gets them into the rhythm of light and dark, and maybe that brings a certain rhythm back to how they're using food and handling food? What do you feel? How do you stand on that?
Well, in my last 2 books, I made a big deal about it. And my last book, The Choose You Now Diet, talks all about time-restricted eating. And I absolutely incorporate it with my clients all the time. I highly recommend it. Right. Interestingly, we don't know if it does make a difference with weight loss. There's research kind of on both sides of it. But from a cognitive behavioral therapy standpoint, it does. Because right. Like a lot of my clients myself included, I don't have an off switch. So the fewer times I have to stop eating, the better it is for me from a behavioral standpoint, not a caloric standpoint. So I have my clients, usually most people eat 2 meals a day. I don't even have them do the window anymore because for the behavioral reasons, but right. There's so much power. And the evidence on health span, so forget weight loss, but the evidence on health span and the potential for longevity is very compelling. And the research just keeps unfolding. Just having time in that state where your body can heal itself, which we right. never let it, people are eating from the time they're awake until the time they go to bed. And then there's 4 to 6 hours from the last swallow to stop that absorption process. It just is so overwhelming for the system. So I'm a huge advocate of time restricted eating. And I do it myself. And it's been one of the best things for my health that I've ever done since plant-based diet.
Yeah, all those factors you mentioned are important. And some of the studies I've seen when they address the weight loss issue, they were coming down to the idea that it's not so much the pattern of time restricted eating, the fact where people were actually restricting calories. There was a calorie restriction because of, as you said, they're eating limited meals, perhaps taking less calories. And so so the point is, though, it's much bigger than just the weight loss itself. It's all the features and factors that you mentioned. Julieanna, as we wind this down, do you have any final words you'd like to share with everybody out here? Any advice or any input you'd like to make to the audience out here?
Sure. I would say, it's really hard out there. I call this the modern day trifecta of overabundance. The first part of this trifecta is that we are biologically adapted to survive in times of scarcity. We have not adapted out of that yet. And we are driven to eat as much calorie when it is in front of us as possible so we can survive. That is our biology, our biochemistry. It is our brainstem primal self. The second part of that trifecta is we're living in this world now, this society with nonstop temptation. We're bombarded with food messaging 24/7 everywhere. And the third part, to make it even worse, is it's normalized to overeat, especially hyperpalatable junk food. And it's now normalized to be overweight or obese. So you are the weird, crazy person who's like saying no to dessert. And you have to stand up against your life. And that again is another survival mechanism, is to be tribal and to not stand out so much. So right. This is what I do with my clients. It's like, you need to be solid in you have to be in your seat knowing what you need and be strong and know what your truth is. And it is not easy. So with that said, I say radical self-compassion. Things happen, life happens, and you are human after all. You do your best, you make a choice, and you get to make your choice. That's the book of my last book, Choose You Now. You get to choose yourself now, again and again and again. And every time you choose what you want in the long term, that delayed gratification, the rewards are unlimited. So just go back to right now and stay in the moment and radical self-compassion.
Well, my special guest today was Julieanna Hever, and I can't thank you enough for sharing your experience, your words of wisdom, and the advice, which is priceless. I urge all of our audience to follow Julieanna. Her location will be in the show notes, plantbaseddietitian.com. And I want to really thank you today for joining us. Really, it's been really eye-opening, I think, for our audience, and it's been very special for everyone. Thank you so much. You've been listening to the Health Science Podcast, brought to you by the National Health Association. Thank you for joining us today and for your commitment to evidence-based health science that backs a whole food, plant-exclusive lifestyle and contributes to the well-being of all people, animals, and our environment. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino. Be sure to leave a rating and a review, and we'll see you on the next show.